so much of individuals, of class, of race, of geopolitics in one book. And we're going to go into that one by one. But what I would like Ben to do first is, what is interesting to me is that Colditz is featured in TV shows. It's been a central character for so many books. It's even a board game. So what led you to revisit Colditz in 2023, 2024? Why is that story still something that you found worth telling?
Oh, thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's fantastic to be back in Jaipur. This is my third Jaipur. It's just wonderful to be here. Colditz. I grew up with Colditz. Now, if you are British of a certain age, the word Colditz has an absolutely specific meaning. If you say, work was terrible today, it was like being in Colditz, everybody knows what you mean. So it's deeply embedded into our language in Britain. And I grew up with it. I mean, I literally grew up with it because in long, rainy weeks in Scotland, where I mostly grew up, we would play Colditz the board game. Which was an exciting adventure game, and the point was you were either British, Dutch, French, or Belgian, I think, and you had to try and escape from the castle. And it was not a complicated game. It did go on for about a week. So in one way, it was kind of the boredom element of Colditz came out quite strongly in the board game. But I loved it. And then there was a very successful 1970s television drama series. In fact, there were 2 seasons of it. And it was then the most popular drama series ever made by the BBC. And it was wonderful. It was mostly fantasy. And that, to answer your question, is really why I decided to write this book, is like many stories from that period, the Colditz story is encrusted with myth and legend. And it tells, or it told when I was growing up, a very simple story of daring do. It was a story of brave British men with moustaches, usually, digging their way to a different sort of victory. So the attempts to escape from Colditz, which are the sort of central element of this story, became a form of resistance. We were talking about this earlier, and it became another way of telling the resistance story. It became a way of dignifying what for many, many people had been a horrendous experience. 350,000 people were held in different prisoner of war camps in Germany and Poland and other places. And for most people, it was a terrible experience, as it was for many in Colditz. But the myth of Colditz painted a quite different story. And the story that I found, and this is true of many of that era's legends, the real story is much more complicated than this kind of straightforward heroic myth. The real story of Colditz is a story about class, about race, about sexuality, about mental health, about many of the things that interest us today that we would see as sort of contemporary subjects. And this is not an attempt to sort of foist a 21st century template on a mid-20th century story. It's really an attempt to re-look at a story through slightly different eyes. And I found it I took the subject on with some trepidation, I have to say, because people constantly said to me, there are many books about Colditz. There are, in fact, dozens of books about Colditz, most of them written in the 1950s and 60s, most of them more or less identical. Why are you writing a book about Colditz? And I began to wonder whether I was taking on something that was already so well known that I was going to be telling the same story. I ended up writing a book that is completely different from any other book about Colditz, I hope.
What I enjoyed most about your book is that there are so many different individuals across different nationalities. I think one of the most arresting for me was Pat Reed. And he is one of the first officers of the Royal Army Corps who's captured in May. He's sent to Colditz. And he's sort of the guy who puts Colditz on the map, so to speak. You tell us about him.
Absolutely. So perhaps I should sort of explain what Colditz is, because there may be people who don't know. Colditz was and is an enormous 11th century Gothic castle in East Germany, near Dresden. It has 700 rooms. It was built by the electors of Saxony over a very, very long period, many centuries. And it's a huge castellated thing that sits on a hilltop. And it's extremely imposing to look at. It's actually now a hotel, believe it or not. You can go and stay in Colditz if you want to. I spent most of one summer in Colditz. I don't necessarily recommend it as a holiday destination, but I became sort of embedded in the place, really. I say it's a hotel, it's more of a kind of youth hostel. But so it is this, it was always intended to be a place of, to impress and to awe and to cow, in some ways, the surrounding countryside. And it's an extraordinary place. And so at the beginning of the war, it was set up as a particular kind of prison camp. It became Oflag 4C, an officers' camp. So it's a very important distinction, this. This wasn't a prisoner of war camp where all prisoners were held. It was a prisoner of war camp specifically for Allied officers who'd been captured. And not only that, they had to be officers who had been defined in the great sort of German nomenclature as Deutschfeindlich, which literally means German unfriendly. Only the Germans would have a word that actually means German unfriendly. And these were people who distinguished themselves by trying to escape from other prison camps. Or they had just made themselves extremely difficult for their captors. So they were already problems for the German Reich. And so the idea was that this would be a prison that would be impossible to escape from. Now, it was a really bad idea because, as I've just explained, Colditz is a rabbit warren. I mean, it's a vast, great thing, and it's full of holes. It has 6 different sewer systems. So, in fact, it's a really stupid place to put a prison camp. The best place to put a prison camp is in a large field surrounded by barbed wire. That's quite hard to escape from. Colditz was actually, at least to begin with, a comparatively not easy place to escape from, but there were different ways you could do it. So that was a bad idea. And the second bad idea was that if you put all the most difficult prisoners in one place, people who've all tried to escape from somewhere else, what do they try and do? They immediately try to escape. So the whole conversation inside Colditz for 5 years was about how to get out of the place. So it's not a good place to have a prison camp. And the very first arrival, which was your question, was a man called Pat Reed, who was a kind of irrepressible Irish rugby international. He was one of those slightly annoying people who never got depressed. He was up the whole time. And he was one of the first people to escape from Colditz. He became the first escape officer, so he was helping others to escape. And he also wrote the first book about Colditz. He actually patented the board game, too. He made a mini industry out of Colditz. He became quite wealthy as a result of Colditz. But he also painted this very specific picture of Colditz. And he gave the wrong impression, which was that everybody in Colditz had been just like him, which they were not.
What I find interesting also about that, you're talking about what you do when a bunch of people get put together. They immediately want to escape from prison. But a curious theme that comes up in this book is honor, right? And the different ways in which, say, the Geneva Convention was adhered to, a promise given to a security guard that we are going on this walk, but nobody can run away from it, right? There was nobody who actually broke that promise also. So honor features in a very curious way in a curious place.
You make a very good point, and this is another important distinction about Colditz. Colditz was run by the Wehrmacht. It was run by the German army. It wasn't a brutal concentration. When we hear the word Second World War prison camp, we automatically and rightly summon to mind the terrible Holocaust camps, the brutal SS extermination camps. Colditz wasn't like that. It wasn't a holiday camp by any degree, but it was run by the German army. And the German army were not all Nazis. Some of them were, but the majority of officers were not. And Colditz was run according to the rules. And the rules were laid down by the Geneva Convention. And so these officers had certain rights, which they were prepared to stand up for. And what's even more interesting, I think, and again, this is completely against the myth that we all inherited, the German officer class inside Colditz were very assiduous about sticking to the rules. In fact, they took deep offense at the idea that they were somehow maltreating these officers. And so there was a kind of honor between the different officer classes, and it became a game of sort of cat and mouse. There's a particular German character who was head of security at Colditz, who I came to really like, actually. He's a wonderful character. He was called Reinhard Eggers, and he was a school teacher. He came from not far from Colditz, and before the war, he had been a school teacher in Britain. he taught at Cheltenham, a rather distinct, sort of refined part of Britain, and he was there for 2 years, and he developed the completely erroneous belief that all British people were like the people he'd met in Cheltenham, who were very polite and kept buying him beer and looking after him. So he couldn't kind of get over the fact that all the Brits in Colditz were incredibly rude to him, but all the people in Cheltenham had been frightfully nice. But he treated them with great respect, really, in lots of ways. And he wrote a wonderful diary in which he's like a sort of tutting schoolmaster. He's sort of shaking his head the whole time. He can't get over the fact that these naughty boys are still trying to break out and set fire to his classroom. So he's a wonderful character, and he sort of bucks the idea of the sort of brutal, one-dimensional sort of Nazi. There were some pretty unpleasant Nazis in Colditz, don't get me wrong, and it was a very nasty place. It was boring, it was cold, they were hungry, there was very little to do apart from trying to escape. So it developed its own sort of internal chemistry, really. And that's one of the things that I loved about it. It was an international camp. Now, if you were British, you'd be forgiven for thinking that there was only British people in it. It wasn't. For most of its life, the majority of prisoners, the largest section, were Poles. So there were many Polish prisoners, all officers, all with the same sort of rights, French, Dutch, Belgian, latterly Americans. So it really was a sort of strange kind of cosmopolitan microcosm, really, of Edwardian society. And these were people, particularly on the British side, who had arrived with they'd often come fresh from British boarding school. And they treated, many of them, Colditz, as if it was just an extension of their school. And so they teased the masters, they made stink bombs, they did all sorts of stupid and puerile things that kind of kept them going through the horror of Colditz.
Let's just stick with the stupid and puerile for a minute. You've written, very interestingly, I mean, you've talked about, when prisoners don't have anything to do, they invent things to do. And a couple of the things that they invented were really brutal games. Goon baiting, for one. Tell us about stool ball and goon baiting, which seemed insane to me when I was reading.
Yep, sort of insane. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it sort of became an art, goon baiting. So a goon was the slang word for a German prison camp guard. And so goon baiting was a sort of competition to try to drive the guards completely mad by teasing them in various complicated and obscure and very babyish ways. And of course, humor is absolutely vital. You find it in every prison. Black, dark humor is one of the ways that people get through this experience. And so goon baiting could take many forms. Whistling on parade. The French developed a way of being able to sing without opening their mouths, which drove the commandant mad. One of the things they loved doing, the Brits, was waiting until the commandant came out for the daily roll call and then staring fixedly at his fly buttons in the hope that eventually he would become self-conscious and check them. And when he did that, that was considered to be an enormous moral victory. And a great cheer would go up. My own favourite of the goon baiting stories is the great wasp goon bait of 1942. That was when the prisoners discovered a large wasp's nest in one of the walls of the castle and began systematically capturing wasps and hiding them in matchboxes. Before doing that, they would tie little messages to their legs with cigarette paper saying Deutschland kaputt on them. On a given signal at one roll call, they all released these wasps simultaneously. The idea being that a vast cloud of wasps, angry wasps by this point, would take off, fly outside the castle, sting Germans, and pass on this very important propaganda message. There's no evidence that a single one of these things ever happened. But it was seriously, it was a way of bonding. It was a way of keeping their spirits up in a very gloomy and grim place. And it was a sort of exercise of the imagination. And so while it seems incredibly silly, which it was, it nonetheless served a strange purpose inside the chemistry. And very quickly, you mentioned stool ball. As I said, it was a sealed society, and so they began to invent their own traditions. It's a very strange sort of British habit, but that every time, 2 or 3 Brits are gathered together, they will invent a new sport. And they did that in Colditz. They invented a sport called stool ball. which could only be played inside Colditz and was only ever played inside Colditz. I wanted to see if we could reenact a game of stool ball. It was incredibly violent, and essentially it was like a cross between rugby and cage fighting. And you played it inside the inner courtyard, which was about the size of a tennis court, covered in very slippery cobbles. And you had two teams of about 30 people who simply had to kind of fight their way, holding a ball from one end of the courtyard to the other, where there was a stool, and if they could knock the person off the stool with the ball, then they got a point. And it was incredibly violent, and the Germans found it utterly baffling. People were quite badly injured sometimes, but it was a great way of sort of blowing off steam as well. I think one of the reasons there were so few actual fist fights in Colditz was because they played a lot of stool ball.
I mean, speaking of ways to exercise the imagination, theatre was also a big part of how prisoners kept themselves occupied at Colditz. And you've written about Mickey Burns, who became a sort of philosopher poet almost of Colditz. And I mean, interestingly, Mickey Burns is also the father of Audrey Hepburn. But tell us about theatre and how that was sort of a way to keep people occupied and a sort of another release of pressure and tension.
Absolutely. I mean, it was the theatre in Colditz is actually rather beautiful. It's quite small. It can seat about 200 people, and it has rather lovely sort of paintings on the walls. And it became absolutely the sort of cultural focus of the whole castle. And in the first 2 years of the existence of Colditz as a prisoner of war camp, there was a new production of some sort in Colditz Theatre once every 3 or 4 days. And the different nationalities, wonderfully, would compete with each other to put on plays and pantomimes and ballet and concerts. There was a Polish pipe band. And one of the odd things, again, because they were officers, they had they were allowed to bring in costumes and scenery paint and equipment to build proper scenery inside this theatre. But they had to do it on again, it brings back your question of honour. They had to promise that they wouldn't use the equipment they brought in for theatrical purposes to try to escape. So the drills and the hammers and the nails, and they were only, and there's no evidence they ever did use this for any kind of escape. So the theatre is a fascinating thing, and there's a wonderful photograph I found of a sort of a review, as it were, that was put on in Christmas 1941, and it's called Ballet Nonsense. And it was a set of sort of skits and sketches and mad things. But the central element of it was apparently rather a good ballet performance by the corps de ballet, led by Pat Reed, this enormous burly rugby player. And they're all dressed in tutus. They're dressed in these kind of frilly skirts. Cross-dressing was also a big thing in Colditz.
Inventiveness also went to escape, and we can't talk about Colditz without talking about these numerous attempts to escape. Lots of these guys were very inventive about how they tried to escape. I think one of the most, it's not a fun story, but it was an interesting story, was the glider that they actually pulled together. And that was one of the most sort of outlandish methods of escaping, where you basically cobbled it together from old headboards and stuff like that. It was also, you pointed out, I mean, I obviously want you to tell us more about that, but you've also used a beautiful metaphor for it, which is that it sort of represented a sort of metaphor for hope and freedom for everyone who was in Colditz. So apart from the stupid and the puerile, there was also a sense of very real sort of desperately clinging on to someday there's going to be escape.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, this is an escape attempt, and as I say, there were many, many escape attempts. At the beginning, I mean, they were happening at least once a week. In fact, there were so many different tunnels being built out of Colditz in the first year that they were quite literally undermining each other. They kept tripping over each other as they were trying to escape, so they had to set up a kind of international committee, yeah. So it was a bit like the EU, really. They had a sort of talking shop thing, and then they elected, an escape officer for each nationality, and the idea was that they would sort of inform each other when they were going to attempt an escape, so they didn't trip each other up. And it worked brilliantly. Of course, the French wouldn't do it at all. They sort of pretended they were doing it, but they really weren't. Again, like the EU, the British sort of stayed in until they sort of walked out. but it worked for a bit, and it was. But the one you refer to is, I think, it's the most astonishing of all the attempted escapes. Towards the end of the war, they built an entire glider in the attics of one of the buildings in Colditz, and it had a wingspan of 30 feet. It was constructed from bits of old sheeting, matting. They used all the sort of bed springs they could get their hands on. It had 600 different parts. And the idea was that when the moment came to use this thing to escape, that it was a two-man glider. They'd built a kind of temporary launch pad, which was going to sit on the apex of the longest roof in Colditz. Then they were going to bring the glider out, reassemble it on the roof. Then they had a system of ropes and pulleys and, believe it or not, a bath filled with cement. They were going to drop the cement-filled bath off the end of the roof and then catapult this thing into the air with the idea that if the wind was in the right direction, it would stay aloft just long enough to get them across the river and land on the other side. It was an astonishing feat of engineering, and it was built. There's one photograph of the Colditz glider. It never flew because the war ended before it could be used. Whether it would have worked, I mean, I've talked to quite a few aeronautical engineers who said that this thing, with two men in it, would have gone straight to the end of the roof and then plummeted 90 feet, killing both of them. But in a way, as you sort of allude, it wasn't really intended in some ways to fly. It was a way of everybody who was left in the castle in 1944 to work together on one project. And in some ways, they were very clever, the engineers. I think they knew that this was literally a flight of fancy, a flight of fantasy. It was a way to imagine, for all of the people in the castle, to imagine themselves soaring outside the castle to freedom. So it had a kind of psychological effect in a way that was, I think, probably greater than its practical effect. And that was the last gasp. But there were many other astonishing. I mean, the tunneling that went on in Colditz was absolutely extraordinary. It was like a Swiss cheese by the end of it.
I mean, I think there are so many fascinating stories of the individuals in Colditz that we could probably be here all afternoon discussing this. I would strongly suggest that you buy Ben's book rather than we do that. But talking about things that are less unifying was the question of class, right? As you mentioned, Colditz was primarily an officers' prison, but there were privates, there were NCOs who were also there, who were allowed to be there under the Geneva Convention, but they weren't allowed to leave, unlike the officers. And one great sort of example of that was Douglas Bader. So, if you could...
Yes, this is one of the sides of Colditz that I had no idea about before I started looking into this subject, which is that there was a rigid class division running right the way through the middle of Colditz, because there were the officer class, but under the Geneva Convention, as you say, those officers had the right to have servants. They were each allowed to have a servant, and those servants were ordinary prisoners. They were privates who'd been captured. They were prisoners of war just as much as the officers, but they were not allowed to escape. Their job was to be in Colditz and to cook and clean and to generally sort of look after the officers. And it's a different world from ours. The idea that somehow one set of people had the right to escape and another set of people did not. It was denied to them. But even more extraordinary, I mean, the British class system, as we all know, is a completely mad thing that sort of.
You had clubs as well.
You had clubs. So you had you had the ruling class, who were the officers. Then you had the working class, who were the privates. But then you had an aristocracy above that. There was a separate group called the prominente, who were individuals selected by the Germans as being people of particular social or political value. So there was a nephew of the two nephews of the king. There was Winston Churchill's nephew was in there. There was the son of the American ambassador. So these were the kind of, and they lived separately. They had separate provisions. They had their own gramophone record. They lived under perfect sort of very, very tight security. They were more hostages than they were prisoners in a way. And believe it or not, within them, there was yet another group. Some of you may have heard of the Bullingdon Club. There was a Bullingdon Club in Colditz, And in order to belong to the Colditz Bullingdon Club, which is a very exclusive Oxford dining club, famous for smashing up restaurants in the 1960s, and then, I mean, I wasn't a member, but very, very exclusive. And so it's a weird thing about Brits. Whenever three are gathered together, three male Brits, they will form, two of them will form a club to exclude the third. And so the Bullingdon was a kind of, if you like, it was a club within a club within a club. And rigidly maintained. So there was a sort of snobbery element inside Colditz that shouldn't be forgotten. And I could find no evidence of any orderly, any of these sort of POWs, private POWs, ever attempting to escape from Colditz. So it was purely an officer pastime.
I mean, when you talk about snobbery and exclusion, I think nobody would have felt that more than Birendranath Mazumdar, who was an amazing, I mean, the story of Birendranath Mazumdar, he's essentially an officer with the Royal Medical Corps in the army. And he comes into Colditz. It's the height of the war. And he basically refuses offers to actually leave because, and this is where Colditz, for me, offered a sort of sense of a wider geopolitical landscape against which a prison was functioning. He was actually asked by Subhash Chandra Bose's men whether he wanted to join them. I mean, that in itself is an amazing story. I don't think we hear too much of that here at all.
Well, it's really never been told before. I mean, the story, Birendranath Mazumdar was the only non-white officer in Colditz. He was an Indian doctor. He grew up near Calcutta. He was educated both in India and in Britain. He was an extremely good doctor. He was with the Royal Army Medical Corps. He was captured at Dunkirk. He was a tricky character, Mazumdar. He was great. I mean, he didn't take anything from the Germans at all, and they quickly labelled him Deutschfeindlich and took him off to Colditz, where he suffered terribly. Not from the Germans. The Germans regarded Mazumdar as a propaganda opportunity, but from his fellow officers, not just the Brits. He was treated, because he was a person of colour, he was treated as a second-class citizen. And he was told that, unlike all the other officers, he was not allowed to escape. They said, Biren, you're the wrong colour. As soon as you get out of here, you'll be captured. There are no Indians in Germany, which was not true, actually. And so Mazumdar's story is both very poignant, I think, and incredibly inspiring, because Mazumdar wasn't taking any of this. At the beginning of the war, not the beginning, in about late 41, Subhash Chandra Bose, who many in the audience will know about, the sort of nationalist leader of India, who was making at that point, it has to be said, common cause with the Nazis. He was taking German money. He was trying to get backing from Germany. He was raising Indian troops to fight on the Axis side. And they saw Birendranath Mazumdar as a huge opportunity. And they tried to recruit him to broadcast to India to try to persuade Indians to rise up against British rule. I mean, it was in a way that simple. And Mazumdar was flattered. He was offered his freedom. He was offered an apartment in Berlin. And twice they brought him to Berlin to try to persuade him to join them, to join Subhash Chandra Bose's sort of campaign. And he thought very hard about it. He was a great admirer of Subhash Chandra Bose. He was himself a very fervent Indian nationalist. He was a great supporter of Gandhi. And so this was a really sort of dark night for him, I think. And he thought long and hard, and in the end he decided that he couldn't give up, he couldn't go against his word. He'd given an oath to the British Crown, and he was going to stick to it.
Honor comes back here.
Honor comes back again. And so he returned to Colditz. He was beaten up in Berlin. He was brought back to Colditz, thinking, well, now my fellow officers will treat me with some respect. On the contrary, they now regarded him as a spy. They believed that he must be on the other side because he'd been looked after in Berlin. So he went on a hunger strike. At the same time as Gandhi, he followed Gandhi's hunger strike. And he eventually, the commandant became so panicked by this hunger strike, because Mazumdar said, unless you release me from this prison and put me in the only all-Indian prison, there was one in occupied France, he said, unless you remove me and put me in this other prison, I'm going to starve myself to death. And he got out, and the commandant moved him. And I'm not going to give away what happens, but he escaped. I mean, Mazumdar's escape is an astonishing achievement. I'm going to give it away, actually. Buy the book anyway. With a Sikh cavalry officer, the two of them broke out of this all-Indian prison and walked 900 kilometers to neutral Switzerland and across the border. At which point, Mazumdar was arrested by the British, who said that he had to be a traitor. He couldn't have done this. And he ended up as a GP, as a doctor in Somerset, where he spent the rest of his life. And he never talked about this story, except that I found, one of the lovely things I found when researching this book was I found some tapes that he'd recorded just before his death in 1996, which his wife, who's still alive, she's wonderful, Joan, she's 96, had never listened to either. And we sat there listening to these tapes in which he described his experience in Colditz, and the two of us were in floods of tears by the end of it, because it's a perfectly hidden story of a man who had to escape twice. Once from Colditz and once from this kind of rigid racial system that he found himself in.
I mean, this is just such a great example of the kind of stories that this book has, right? And I mean, espionage and you go hand in hand. So, I mean, there was espionage at some point happening within Colditz as well, right? Information began flowing out. And these officers found ways of getting information that was crucial for the Allied effort back home. How did that develop?
Colditz had its own intelligence system, astonishingly. And at this point, I'm delighted to be able to introduce a female character into this story. There was a wonderful Czech flying officer in Colditz called Čeko Chalupka, who was a kind of loose, debonair man with a sort of twinkly eyes and a thin moustache. And he'd flown for the Czech Air Force, then for the French, then for the British, and he was captured, brought to Colditz. Amazingly, on his way to Colditz in the train, chained up with two soldiers on either side of him, he happened to find himself opposite a very attractive young woman called Irma Wernicke, who was from Colditz. And he said, "Oh, I'm being taken to Colditz," and they got into conversation. And as I say, he was a sort of Lothario Checo. And by the end of it, they had established a kind of tendresse. And she whispered to him, "I'm the dental assistant in Colditz town. If you can fake a dental emergency, you can come down and visit me in the town." So sure enough, that's what Checo did. He, by the extreme expedient of chipping one of his teeth with a rock, he managed to get himself taken down to Colditz, where he bribed the town dentist to give him some time alone with Irma. And it's the only example of a heterosexual love affair in Colditz. Checo managed to get himself down to see the dentist no fewer than 10 times. By the end of the war, his teeth were in a terrible state. But his love life was going gangbusters. But Checo and Irma, between them, founded what became known as the Colditz intelligence system. So Irma, amazingly, turned out to be an anti-Nazi resistance operative. There was a small cell of young Germans. Colditz was a very Nazi town, but a number of the younger people were deeply opposed to the Third Reich. And she began to feed information via Checo back to Colditz, where it was being sent to British intelligence in secret coded letters. There was a very long-established, brilliant, I reproduced the code in the book, there was a very complex coding system where letters, again, an officer's privilege, could be sent back to Britain, but with hidden messages in it. And by the end of the war, they were producing a lot of extremely useful intelligence, where the local ammunition was being kept, local troop movements, those sort of really useful things for when the Allies were beginning to advance on Colditz. And the story of the love affair between Irma and Checo, I mean, it sort of has a sort of happy ending. Needless to say, Checo at the end of the war sort of abandoned Irma immediately. And Irma just got out of Colditz just before the Soviets arrived, and she ended up in California, where she married Ronald Reagan's bodyguard.
So,
if you put that in a novel, people would say that's just completely inconceivable.
Absolutely. All of this is inconceivable, really, especially sitting here. Today, I'm going to ask one last question before we open the floor for questions. And that is tied into the theme of espionage, which is to say that all of this functioned within a larger sort of network of resistance that went all the way back to London, right? So you had a unit which you've mentioned in your book, MI9, but you also mentioned the Polish underground resistance. You also mentioned the efforts of a wonderful woman called Mrs. M. in helping prisoners who were escaping sort of to find safe passage. So there was a whole sort of ecosystem within which Colditz and resistance to Nazis, to the Nazi rule sort of functioned.
Absolutely. I mean, you put it very, very well. I wish I'd put it that way in the book, actually. I mean, Colditz became part of a much wider element of sort of holding out against the Germans. Of course, since the only parts of the British Isles that were ever occupied by the Nazis were the Channel Islands, where the resistance was patchy, to put it mildly, this was a way, the whole Colditz story became a way of sort of demonstrating British resistance to Nazi rule, to immediate Nazi rule, as it were. And as you say, yes, it was a huge system. You mentioned Mrs. M, again, one of my favorite characters. She was a Scottish woman who had ended up in Poland. She spoke perfect Polish. She was married to a Pole. To all intents and purposes, she was Polish, but she wasn't. And she was running an escape system out of Warsaw. And that was the place where many of the escapees from Colditz, and this is another point, there weren't that many escapes from Colditz. I mean, there were many, many escape attempts, but only 16 people over the course of 5 years actually made what they called a home run, actually got across the borders. Because it was getting out of Colditz was difficult. Getting out of Germany was even harder. And Mrs. M, as she was called, ran one of the escape cells inside, or the key escape cell, really, for escaping prisoners. And she would hide them in her parlor for weeks and then send them off on these sort of established escape routes. And it's thought that not all from Colditz, obviously, but at least 20 escaped prisoners and downed airmen they got out because of Mrs. M. And she's a wonderful, sort of redoubtable, tough Scotswoman. I mean, she made them all sing the national anthem every time they came round, and constant toast to the king and all that sort of nonsense. But she was made of a kind of strange resistance material. She's one of my favorites in the book.
I think all of them were made of a strange resistance material, which is why this book is so great. The floor is now open for questions, not just about Colditz, but any of Ben's other incredible work. Second row. Yeah. Is there a mic for the gentleman? Or?
Do we have a mic? Just coming. It's just coming.
I am the son of a Kriegi, which those you will know is what they called POW, short for Kriegsgefangener. My father was Canadian who joined the RAF in 1937, and as a flight lieutenant was shot down over Hamburg into the Elbe River, and spent 3 years in Stalag Luft 3. And he was one of the people vaulting over the famous wooden horse. Wow. But I have to say, among families of ex-Kriegis, there's a certain, this Colditz thing sticks in our craw, that it's taken over by the MOD. Oh, you're valiant Britain, right? That during the war, the MOD docked the officers their pay, POW officers their pay. And they grieved it after the war, and the MOD, Ministry of Defense, slapped the Official Secrets Act on it. And we did not get a settlement until the 1960s, when we were able to prove that ex-POWs died an average of 10 years earlier than the general veteran population. The other thing, that one word you never mentioned, was Canadian, right? In all
Canada?
of that. Canadian.
Oh, right.
Right? Who dug all those tunnels? It was hard rock miners from northern Ontario.
Not entirely.
Well, they were very prominent in it.
There are plenty of Canadians in my book. In fact, it opens with the Canadians who are the first arrivals in Colditz. So I'll refute that allegation. But you're right. Escaped prisoners, not escaped prisoners, the prisoner of war story was not a story that any Allied country wanted to have after the war. For many of the former prisoners, this was a source of shame, particularly the ones who had been captured early in the war. the professional soldiers, they felt, many of them, and this is vivid in Colditz and all other prison camps, they felt that they had failed in the duty that they had been appointed to do. So there is a sort of psychological element that the MOD, and indeed all countries that had fought in the war, did not want to talk about the prisoner experience. And you're right. I mean, they were appallingly treated. They were ignored largely. And I make this point in the book. Colditz was partly a propaganda exercise after the war. It was intended to uplift this story. And it does obscure the many hundreds, indeed hundreds of thousands of other prisoners whose experience was very different. As I said at the beginning, this was an officers' camp. If you were in a Stalagsluft, they were better than some, but if you were in an ordinary prison camp, this was a terrible experience, and it was not properly looked at, after the war. So thank you. Lovely.
Thank you very much for that really insightful talk. I just wanted to ask, what was the, how does Germany remember Colditz as well? Because we've heard about allies, but it would just be great to know what Germany thinks about it and how they remember Colditz.
Well, the reality is that they sort of don't remember Colditz. I mean, Colditz is a big myth for the Allies because it was in East Germany and it was taken over by the Soviets and it was sort of run on communist lines. This wasn't a story that East Germany wanted to celebrate. And in fact, many of the artifacts from Colditz, which were gathered assiduously by Reinhold Eggers, the officer I told you about, were dispersed immediately after the war. They were sort of sold off. So for many years, the Colditz story in Germany wasn't really addressed at all. That said, I was amazed by how many of the former German officers, the former German guards, had written their own accounts of what Colditz had been like for them. And therefore it is possible, and I hope I've done this in the book, to look at it from a quite different perspective, which was from not just from the German officer class, but some of the NCOs and indeed some of the ordinary guards wrote about the experience of running this camp. And it wasn't much fun for them either. I mean, actually 2 of the guard troop committed suicide in the course of the war. So the German perspective is fascinating. And even today, if you go to Colditz, the German authorities celebrate the story of the electors of Saxony and this beautiful castle that was built and the years that it was a sort of emblem of sort of that part of history. The Colditz Museum, the little escape museum, is tiny. I mean, it's about 10 feet, no, I'm exaggerating, maybe it's 20 feet square, but it's really very small. So they see that as just one element of this story. And again, after the war, when the Soviets were running East Germany, they regarded the people who had been running this castle, the German group, as being Nazis, which they were not, most of them. And Eggers was arrested. And he was sentenced, he spent 10 years inside a Soviet prison camp. He suffered far worse, far more deeply than any of the prisoners that he had held in Colditz. And what I loved about him was that he held no sort of resentment about this. He was extremely welcoming to any of the former British prisoners that he'd known. And in fact, Pat Reed, who we started the story with, there was an episode of This Is Your Life, which was a British TV series where somebody's life would be sort of gone over. And this was done for Pat Reed, and the surprise guest was Reinhold Eggers, who turned up, this German who'd locked him up for 3 years, turned up and they sort of embraced each other, which I think is very, very moving. So for Germany, it's a complicated story it's sort of partly hidden. Lovely. Yes, sir.
Hello, sir.
Who has the mic? Yes, sir, at the front there. Yes, in yellow.
Yep. So you've written about spies and agents and gentleman criminals, Adam Worth and all that. So is your interest in them their outsized impact on society or perhaps history? Or what is your allure in these smart and frankly sneaky men?
I don't know. I'm very worried about it. I mean, I only write about crooks and skullduggery and these. I think I prefer rogues to great men of history or men and women of history. I like the underside of history. I've always felt, particularly with the wartime story, and Colditz is a good example of this, it's often presented to us as a kind of moral fable, that somehow there was a good side and a bad side, and of course, overall that is right. But on the good side, as it were, there were people who didn't behave well, and lots of people did the right thing for the wrong reasons, and lots of people did the wrong thing for the right reasons, and the buzzer's gone. So, but yeah, I think there's probably something wrong with me. I love these sort of twisted. I love the twisted material, the twisted timber. I find that much more interesting than the sort of the straight planks. Also, I was when I left Cambridge, I was recruited very, very briefly by the intelligence service. So that, I think, gave me a taste for skullduggery. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, Ben.
Subscribe to One India channel and never miss an update.